Okay, having faced off the front of your material, you can see now that that's a lovely flat polished looking surface. We're now going to put our centre drill into the end, and you'll notice that in the tailstock here I have the Jacob's chuck mounted as opposed to the live centre, which is sometimes put in for a different sort of operation. In the Jacob's chuck I've got a centre drill, and most of our centre drills are gold coloured. And this is in contrast to this, which is a standard twist drill. In order to put the first hole into the end of your bar, you must have a centre drill. I'm going to bring the tailstock into position into the front of my material, and then using this lever here, I'm going to lock it in position. Now this works backwards to a drill in that within a drill, usually the drill turns and the material is stationary. Within a lathe, obviously the material is going to rotate and the drill remains stationary, but I'm just going to bring that into the end of my material here. Just like that. So all I've done is brought in the tip of my drill just to create a little hole. Now this is going to be used for centering up if I need to take this job out of the lathe. If I need to take it out of the lathe, sometimes it's difficult to get it re-centered and it's quite wobbly. So you can see now I'm putting my live center into my tailstock, because we're going to be using that to support my work while I clean up this edge. So I'm going to true up my edge now here, which will involve then changing my auto feed, whereby the knob is out to go across. Because I now want to go along, I'm going to be pushing this in, and it will now allow the tool, when it's automated, to travel along my material. Now the same idea is true when we are skimming the edge. We're going to be taking off a minute bite at a time. Now I'm just going to bring that in till it's touching my material, and then I'm going to come to my handle that controls how much the tool goes in and out, and I'm going to hold the outside here, and as I do that I'm going to rotate this till I get back to zero, the 0 point there, where there is a line and a zero. Now I know from experience, I'm going to move my tool out of the way, that if I bring it round to 0.8, that it will remove a millimetre of thickness off that material. Okay, so we're ready to start cutting now. Having got this set up, I'm going to put my auto feed on by pulling up the black knob, and we're going to see that tool travel down. And I'm going to add a little bit of lubricant, either from a can like this or from a spray can. What you do need to be really careful of is thinking about where the cutting tool is in relation to the chuck. Now obviously the teeth of the chuck are whirring round at this end, and you need to make sure that you knock off the auto feed prior to getting anywhere near those teeth, because if it hits that, you're going to break the tool. So I've got plenty of space done now, so I'm going to stop that, and I'm going to bring that away and move that back to the beginning of my job. Right, now I've skimmed that, so I now can guarantee that that is perfectly square with the machine. And I can take a reading in terms of the thickness of this material now with a vernier, and using this in conjunction with my technical drawing, establish how much I've got to cut off. Now my vernier says that I've got an outside diameter on this bar of 41 millimeters. Now I need to create a shoulder at the front of this where there's a section that is 30 millimeters in diameter by 13 millimeters along the bar. So I'm going to mark myself a point using my vernier again here, which is 13 millimeters. So if I bring this into 13, that's 13 millimeters on there, and I'm going to bring my tool up and along so that it's going to touch on my bar 13 millimeters up, because I want to create a mark to work to. And I'm going to start my machine, and I'm going to bring in my cutter, to create a mark. Now, that section that I've just marked off needs to be 30mm diameter. So I'm going to bring my tool in again. I'm going to make sure it's zeroed. And now I'm going to be taking off 1mm at a time. Now I've measured this at 40mm outside, so I know that actually I need to take off 10mm in total. So I'm going to take off 1mm now. Just up to my mark, and then I'm going to knock off. And I'm going to come back to the beginning. I'm going to re-center and re-zero my gauge, come across to 0.8 again and repeat that process. Come back to the beginning. Be careful when you're clearing the swarf off this. Don't be tempted to do it with your hand because it's very sharp, but you will need to clear it sometimes so you can see what you're doing. So I'm going to re-zero now again on here and then turn it round to 0.8 again and reactivate my auto feed. Come back to the beginning. I'm going to re-zero by holding and turning. Coming back to 0.8. So I must have taken 4mm off now, but I'm going to check after this with my vernier again, and that's really important. You can always take material off, but you can't put it back on again, and it saves a lot of time if you are careful with your measuring. So I'm going to put my vernier on there again, and what I'm expecting to see is this having gone down 4mm. Yeah, so we're now at around 36. Recenter and re-zero my cutter, and then I'm going to wind it in another millimetre. I'm going to activate the auto feed. Bring it back to the beginning, re-zero, 0.8. Back to the beginning, re-zero, 0.8. Back to the beginning, re-zero, 0.8. Take 1 more millimetre off, and then I'm going to check my dimensions. Come back to the beginning. I'm going to stop and measure now. So we're on 4 more millimetres to remove. So re-zeroing on my cutter, coming round to 0.8. As you get closer to your target diameter, it's worth stopping it more often and more frequently testing your diameter, because it's very easy to forget how many times you've been in. So I'm just checking this again. I'm now down to 32, which means I've got to do 2 more passes. So we're re-zeroing again on our cutter and taking it in 1 millimetre. Should be my last time. Alright, it's just fractionally over, and it's important that I get this right. So I'm going to now take off a fraction more, but I'm going to be doing this by re-zeroing it and just coming in a fraction of a millimetre. So I know this is, to come around to 0.8 is 1 millimetre, so I'm going to take off 1/4 of a millimetre here. It's a little bit too fine, that cut. Again, rather too little and too much. Test that now. Right, we're now on our target diameter of 30 millimetres. So we're ready to start to think about putting a thread on this now. Now, to put a thread on it, we're going to be needing to use our die, and this here is the die, and we hold a die in this, which is called a die yoke. Now, I'm going to be setting this up in the lathe. I don't need my cutter anymore, so I'm just going to bring that out of the way. And I also need to change over again my tailstock, so that I'm removing my live centre and I'm putting back in the Jacob's chuck that I used earlier when I was drilling. So to get rid of that, if you bring the tailstock back in, it self-ejects, so we can then bring in the Jacob's chuck again, and then if you wind that tailstock sleeve out, just to make sure that that's correctly fitted, it's on a taper. Okay, we're going to need to remove the centre drill now, and then wind the jaws of the chuck back inside itself. So if you look at the little jaws here, we want to get rid of those, so we're going to wind them back in like we're trying to accommodate a giant drill bit. Just drawing them back in, because I'm going to use the face of the Jacob's chuck here against my die to square up, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. Bring in then the die now, and notice which side is which. Here you have much more of a hollow, and here it's quite flat. So I'm going to be presenting the flat edge here, flat side, onto my bar, my newly turned bar. Just trying to get that in the best position possible. Okay, then I'm going to be bringing in my tailstock so that it's holding then this yoke against my bar, and I'm going to lock that in position. Okay, now I can lift up my guard now, because we're not actually going to be turning the machine on, but we do need to take it out of gear. It's a little bit like a car in that it has gears. So we're going to come across the gear knob on this side here, which is set at G at the moment, and all I'm going to do is push it in and twist it round to halfway between the F and G, and this will allow me then to rotate the chuck freely. Okay, now I'm going to pull this over by hand, but as I do that, you're going to want to watch what I'm doing with the tailstock as well, because I'm going to need to take the pressure in the tailstock as the die creeps up my bar. Obviously it will create a gap between the tailstock and the bar, so you'll see that as I'm working this round, and I'm going to be keeping some tension on the end of my tailstock here, as I work this round I'm also going to be winding slightly on the tailstock. Now just be careful as you're doing this, because it's possible that the key will come out of the lathe. So just be a little bit careful. Right, I've done about 3 rotations on that, and I'm going to put a bit of oil on. You need to keep this very well lubricated as you cut, because obviously it doesn't really want to have to cut through this aluminium, and you're going to be making it do that. So initially you're going to do about 6 turns. After you've done 6 turns, you're going to take the lock off on the tailstock, and you're going to go back on yourself. If you zoom in right close onto this now, I'm going to be pushing the material or the chuck backwards, and what we're looking for is to clear that swarf out. So I've gone back probably about a quarter of a turn. It's cleared the swarf, so now we're ready to put the lock back on the tailstock and to continue going down. So you can do about 4 turns, and then we're going to take the lock off it again and work backwards to clear the swarf again. Okay, that's it. Lock it off again, put the tension back on, and let's continue round. About 4 times down. Then take the lock off, let it run back, just to clear the swarf, put the lock back on. Sometimes if it gets very hard, pulling this over with the chuck key, you can find a bar to increase the leverage. Okay, take the lock off again, come back, clear that. Put the lock back on, and we'll continue round. Now you don't need to take this right up against the shoulder. I'm almost there. I'm just going to go back one more time. Just to clear that. Just a couple more turns. So, when the die is obviously almost touching your shoulder, that's going to be close enough. You can take your lock off, and then you can withdraw your tailstock. You're very simply going to reverse this now, off here, and unscrew it. So as I run this over backwards, you should see that making its journey back down and off. revealing what should be quality thread. Don't be impatient with it, because you don't want to chew the thread up as you're coming off. It'll be a hell of a lot easier when it's coming off. So there you should be able to see that we've cut that thread on the end there. Sometimes you might just need to clean it up with a bit of oil and a rag, like that. You can test that by trying to offer up against it something with the opposite thread. You should be able to then screw that very neatly onto that end there. Okay, now at the shoulder end of this, I need to come in a couple of millimeters to clear away unnecessary material. So I'm going to come in at this point here where I haven't actually got a thread on, and I'm going to cut that so that that diameter there is smaller than the outside diameter here. That will allow you to then screw this into your pipe without it getting jammed. So I'm going to change tools for that, and I'm going to come over to putting a parting tool in here now. And the parting tool is this one here, which is very narrow. That's for cutting material off, cutting a bar off. I'm just going to check my centering on this in the same way when I did up originally. We need to have this sitting in the centre of the diameter. And checking that that's in a vertical position. You can see that the scrap piece of acrylic is sat in a dead vertical position, which means that our cutter is in the centre. So I can bring that out of the way now. And I'm going to start the machine up, put this into position, and I'm going to clean up this area here. Oh, now that's interesting, I've made that mistake. Some of you will do the same thing. Turn the machine on and nothing's moving. It's because I've forgotten to put it back in gear. So if I put that back to G again, it should roar into life. Okay, so I'm going to use just the hand tools here, not the auto feed. And I'm just going to neaten up this area here and undercut my thread. And here. So you now see the thread is sitting up higher on that 30 diameter, and this will enable me then very easily to screw my pipe on top of that, and it will clear the end thread and will happily go all the way up to my shoulder. Okay, now we're ready to part this off. I'm going to take a little bit more out just to clear that thread out a little bit further. We're almost ready to part this off now, which will be cutting the entire thing off the end of our bar. I'm just going to take a little bit more off there. A little bit more off there. Okay. Right, so looking at your drawing, you should then be able to work out how much you're going to have to cut off here. Now, because this is going to be the end cap of our torch, we're going to want probably 10 millimeters. But if you check your drawing, the drawing says between 10 to 13 mil. So if we come back and mark that up in the same way that we did earlier, we've got this set to, there we we go. I'm going to have to bring mine there. Now I'm going to be parting that off. Now I can use my auto feed for that, but you'll remember when we're going acrossways that we use the auto feed with the button pulled out. You're also going to need to make sure that you've got plenty of lubrication on this, because it's going to be reluctant to go through that thickness of material. When it comes away, you're probably going to find that's too hot to touch. So whilst it will drop down onto the table, you should leave it until it cools down before you try and pick it up. Okay, and that is a completed end cap.